Gary Lafort, President, Business and Government Services, Associate Professor, International Business Department, American International College, and Colonel. Lieutenant Colonel Gary Lafort.
Wow, thank you. I gave this presentation about a month or so ago, and the Springfield Library System, didn't realize it, but they have an extensive guest speaker program. And one of the better ones is in 16 acres. And I've talked there a number of times. And the last time they asked me to talk about ISIS. And I wish I could give the presentation to more people, because I really think that this is a timely topic. There's a lot of concern, especially now that ISIS, has been ousted out of Syria and Iraq. People tend to think that, well, the threat has gone away, and that's far from the case. Okay, ISIS. ISIS actually traces its origin back to the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That was the faction that was operating in Iraq back in the 2004 timeframe, just after the end of the war. And the U.S. military was trying to, reconstruct the country after the war. ISIS differs from Al-Qaeda in that ISIS didn't just want to be an organization. It really wanted to create an Iraqi state or an Islamic state that they call a caliphate. And so they started initially in Iraq, and eventually it spilled over into Syria as well. ISIS has gone by a lot of different names. It's generally been referred to as ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq in Syria. The ISO name became popular. The United States, President Obama, and also the French president picked up on the ISO state, which means the Islamic State of Iraq in Levant. And Levant includes more than just Syria and Iraq. It really spreads over to include other Middle Eastern countries, also extending as far as Egypt and Turkey. So it's a much broader definition of what was meant by the Islamic State. The term ISIS is kind of the official term that the ISIS organization used in the news media. They generally referred to themselves as the Islamic State rather than ISIS or ISO. And then another name that became popular but entered the picture was Daesh. And Daesh is the Arabic translation of ISIS. Not really used as much as the other three, but these are the names that you generally see associated with what we generally refer to as ISIS. The Muslim world in general has denounced ISIS as a terrorist group, but with no connection to the Islamic faith. Some of the terrorist activities, some of the violence associated with the movement goes against everything that the Islamic faith is about. So they have been very, very vocal about saying, geez, this organization, we have no affiliation, don't support it, we're against it, because they're trying to distance themselves from the organization. I think in understanding not only ISIS but also Al-Qaeda, there's really two important concepts to understand. The first is this idea of Islam fundamental movement. And this is a movement that's been around for a number of years. And basically the idea is that over time, many Muslims have drifted away from the traditional teachings of Muhammad. And so the movement intent was really to try to bring those who have strayed away back into the fold. Unfortunately, there has been factions within the movement that have really kind of diverted towards more violence, especially towards the West, because many Muslims feel that the reason why many Muslims have moved away from the faith is because of the Western influence, especially because of oil and the Western influence or need for oil. And I think sometimes you need to keep things in context, because the movement of itself is really not wrong. If you think about it, all religions do it. The Islamic, the Jewish faith, you're concerned when Jewish people move away from the traditional teachings of the Quran. You certainly find the Roman Catholic Church and Christianity. We've had it going back to biblical times in terms of the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition. So it's not that the movement itself that received as much attention as the fact that some of the violence that has erupted in the name of the Islamic faith, has really marred the movement as not being very good. And I think the other thing you need to understand in terms of the Middle East is this Sunni Shiite conflict. It really goes back to not the biblical time, but to the death of Muhammad. When Muhammad died in 632 A.D., there was a big issue that arose as to who was going to succeed Muhammad. There were those who felt that the individual had to have a bloodline, and that group became known as the Shiites, representing really the minority, maybe 15 to 20% of Muslims. And the other group, the Sunnis, really felt that you did not have to have that bloodline. You needed to be a religious person that really followed, the tenets of the Islamic faith. And back at the time of Muhammad's death, it was really a religious issue. But over the centuries, it has really manifested itself into a political issue, and it has really divided the Middle East in general. When we think about the Iraq War, after the war, and the U.S. tried to reconstruct the country, we heard constantly about the insurgent movement. Many people thought that the insurgent movement that was going on at the time was really Al-Qaeda and ISIS related. And that wasn't really totally true. A lot of it was really the conflict between the Sunnis and the Shiites. When Saddam was in power, he was basically a Sunni. The Sunni represented a minority in the country, and it was a very, very oppressive regime. When Saddam collapsed, the Shiites who were in the majority were able, through a more democratic process, form a coalition government that really wanted to exclude the Sunnis because of what happened under Saddam. And obviously the Sunnis were against that, and so it really became a very, very long period of insurgency that was really more around this Sunni-Shiite conflict. And this has extended all through the Middle East. When Saddam was still around in Iraq, he represented Sunni, Iran represented the Shiites. We now see with the fall of Iraq, that conflict still exists now. Is Iran sort of against the Saudi Arabia, that's a Sunni country. So you can't understand this concept unless you put it in terms of this conflict and also the movement. As far as the caliphate itself went, it really first started in December 2011 when the U.S. troop withdrawal from Iraq was approved by the Obama administration. And that created a vacuum because there was no U.S. troops left in the area as well. And as you know, Al-Qaeda, or ISIS as we now know it today, started in 2004, and gradually they were able to gain more and more power or influence in the country. They took advantage of the Sunni-Shiite conflict with the end results that we find with the U.S. no longer being there to kind of keep peace between the warring factions, really gave ISIS an opportunity to establish itself. And then later that spilled over into the rebellion that was going on in Syria as far against President Assad, who was considered a very, very oppressive president. In January 2014, ISIS took control of Raqqa, which was a country in a city in Syria, as part of this caliphate idea of being a state rather than an organization. They felt that they needed a headquarters, so they established a headquarters or a capital in Syria when they took over Raqqa. In January 2014, ISIS started to extend its influence in Iraq. They took Fallujah. In 2014, they took control of Tikrit, which was the home of Saddam. And then later they gained access to Mosul, which was up in North Iraq. And this likewise became a capital as far as Iraq goes. Mosul was sort of more of an operational capital. A lot of the support, the supplies, the weapons that ISIS was using was coming more out of Iraq, whereas the capital in Syria was more like an administrative headquarters or a capital in terms of this caliphate state. In June 29th, 2014, ISIS officially created this Islamic State and declared the leader of the group, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, as the ruling caliphate over this new organization. And the vision was to eventually extend it over all of the Muslim world, and it would have one common Islamic authority, which would be this caliphate concept. Obviously, the world became more and more concerned, recognized the fact that the withdrawal of the U.S. troops in 2011 was a mistake. And so, well, before I get into that, this shows you a map of Syria, which is located here, and Iraq, which is located here. For the most part, ISIS had a very, very strong influence over roughly 30-40% of the Iraqi territory by the end of 2014. And they had roughly depending on who you talk to, maybe a 25 to 30% over Syria, mainly in this area and up in the northeast, which was close to Mosul, which was the other capital of the caliphate. The U.S. started to push back once they recognized the mistake that they made as far as creating that vacuum. Very, very quickly, the Obama administration realized that, after all, it was not a JV team as a terrorist group. It was much more than that, a very sophisticated, fairly well-organized organization or Islamic State. June 19, 2014, President Obama announced deployment of 300 military advisors to Iraq. The administration did not want to really commit combat fighting troops. They really was relying on the effort before they left of building up the Iraqi forces, of eventually being able to get to the point where the Iraqi forces could win the war themselves. But the U.S. was willing to provide military assistance. In February 2015, President Obama requested congressional authority for the use of U.S. ground forces, simply because ISIS had gained so much territory, in 2014. Congress wouldn't approve it because when the Obama administration came in, they did not have a clear-cut plan as to what their strategy was. Not only in bringing in the military, but how they were going to, eventually be able to pull them about. Congress was really concerned that we were going to find ourselves in the same situation that we did in the Iraqi war that started in 2003, and they just plain wanted to avoid that. And so, with the assistance of the U.S. military advisors, the Iraqi force over time started to prove that they had the operational capability of repelling ISIS from Iraq. In April 2015, the Iraqi forces retook Tikrit. In December 28, 2015, the Iraqi forces retook Ramadi. In June 2016, Iraqi forces retook Fallujah. July 2017, Iraq forces retook Mosul, which was the beginning of the downfall of the caliphate in initially Iraq and eventually in Syria as well. In October 2017, U.S.-backed forces supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces, which really consisted of a Kurdish fighting force and also Arab fighting support from Saudi Arabia. They were able to eventually retake Raqqa by 2017. So that by the end of 2017, for the most part, ISIS had been ousted out of Iraq altogether. In the case of Syria, they had regained the capital, had really driven out a large portion of the ISIS forces, and most of the forces that were remaining were insurgent type forces that didn't have the same fighting capability, that they had in the 2014 timeframe. Big question that has been come up in the past: how did ISIS really end up, funding its operations? Many people thought it was because of oil, and that was one of the areas. But there were a lot of other areas as well. Certainly, the oil that they were able to get in Iraq, in and around Baghdad, and then up in northern Iraq, is a lot of their sources. They also got a lot of funding from looting of museums and ancient sites and selling artifacts, taxing people that were under their control, looting personal property, confiscating assets from financial institutions that were under their control. A lot of their weapons that they ended up using during the conflicts actually came from U.S. weapons that were captured both in Iraq and Syria. And also payment from kidnapping and in slave trade, especially women and children. And there was also financing from Arab entities around the Arab world to include ISIS sympathizers, not only in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world, as well. With the end of the caliphate, what does big question is, does the ISIS threat go away? Since the international intervention in Iraq and Syria, ISIS has evolved a new global threat as to how it was going to continue to maintain its global presence. And that's been targeted at terrorizing the world at large, especially those countries responsible for destroying the caliphate, and also spreading its jihadist war to other parts of the world, especially realizing that as the war winded down in the Middle East, and as the fighters were driven out of the country, many of them were foreigners, foreign fighters from Europe, from the United States, and other parts of the world. They were going back to their home country, and they were going to become part of that sort of covert force that would occasionally, surface, as we've seen in Europe, for example, in Germany and France and the UK. It now has operatives in the Arabian Peninsula, Africa, Southeast Asia, and in South Asia. And this map gives you an idea of the fact that since they have moved out of Iraq and Syria, they have really expanded their operation and what they call affiliates that are continuing, to advance their goal on a global basis. What is the ISIS threat facing us today? Think about it. I said they have re-strategized how they are going to continue to conduct their global war. It now uses social media as a tool for recruiting young people around the world. Their messages are encrypted messages that we have found extremely difficult to decode, in some cases virtually impossible. I mean, look at how long it took us to finally get access to the telephone of the terrorist activity that occurred in San Bernardino, California. Almost took a congressional act of Congress to do that. It no longer relies on automatic weapons and explosives. It now uses knives, hatchets, pressure cookers, laptops, cars, trucks, and vans as weapons of death. Its propaganda now focuses on small cell operations, lone wolves, and returning foreign fighters as surrogates for waging war on a global basis. It has shifted to venues like soft targets, like nightclubs, outdoor entertainment locales, convention centers, churches, where little to no security is available. They're no longer going at the hard targets that have heavy security in place. They're now going at the softer targets that are virtually impossible to detect until such time that the event, the tragedy or attack occurs. And their theme sort of to be, well, since they're no longer in Iraq and Syria, they are now looking at the rest of the world as their backyard. Another element that a lot of people are starting to lose sight of, ISIS has taken the news in the past, but with the ousting of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, Al-Qaeda has had the opportunity over the past 5 years or so to re-insurge itself. And so I think we're going to find that going into the foreseeable future, we're not going to hear not only more about ISIS, but we're also going to hear more about Al-Qaeda. I think Al-Qaeda presents a much greater threat to the United States because ISIS was just interested in establishing this global caliphate. They are going to target any country around the world that has precluded them from doing that. Al-Qaeda has specifically zoned in on the United States as being the principal Western country that has resulted in the deterioration of the Islamic, religion in the Middle East. And so that's where their focus is. That's why when you hear about Al-Qaeda, a lot of their activities, think about 9/11, are directed here in the United States rather than other parts of the world, which is the case as far as ISIS goes. Iran must also be diligent of Al-Qaeda. The Afghanistan war certainly disrupted the Al-Qaeda organization and killed many of its leadership. The war against ISIS, however, has given Al-Qaeda the breathing time they need to reorganize. They have learned from, lessons learned from ISIS. And I do believe, as I said, that Al-Qaeda probably presents the greatest threat to the United States in the foreseeable future. And certainly there's that possibility that there's going to be conflicts between ISIS and Al-Qaeda themselves as they try to reestablish themselves on a global basis. And that global consequences of fighting each other is going to have a global consequence as well, depending on what country, an attack takes place between the two. What can we do to protect ourselves against this ever-present threat? One, there's an international community effort that's been underway for about 5-6 years. We need to continue that. There's actually a U.S. coalition, which I really didn't realize is it's actually a military operation. It's called the U.S. Global Coalition to Counter ISIS that was formed in 2014. And there is an ongoing international operation to continue to seek out and destroy ISIS called Operation Inherent Resolve. The Arab world, through its Islamic Military Counterterrorism Alliance established in 2015, needs to take the lead in countering this threat. In the end, when it's all said and done, the answer to Al-Qaeda and to ISIS is really in the hands of the Arab people or the Arab countries, because to a large extent, a lot of financial support comes out of Arab countries in entities. We as Americans need to support our government in its efforts against terrorism. I know there's been very, very strong opposition to some of the policies Trump has taken as far as immigrants coming into the United States, especially from those countries that have had a history of terrorist, type activities. It's not that he's saying he doesn't want immigrants coming into the countries from these areas. He's just saying that we need to really tighten up on the vetting process that we use so that we can identify those who really do present a threat to the United States. We as individuals, we have a role to play as well. We need to be more aware of the environment that we now live in. We're in an environment now where we no longer can just go any place and think nothing's going to happen. You really have to recognize the fact that terrorism of a global reach can strike any place in the world at any time. And so we do need to be more aware of our environment. We need to talk to our children about what to do in a terrorist situation, discuss the run, hide, fight approach for active shooter situations, which is actually supported. It hasn't been created by the FBI, but it's been supported by the FBI. And I thought it'd be worthwhile to share this concept of run, hide, and fight approach when you find yourself in a terrorist situation, especially an active terrorist situation involving a shooter. And finally, we need to, notify local, state, and or federal authorities when we see something suspicious or out of the ordinary. That's the hardest part, because nobody ever really wants to be the one to say, oh, geez, I think that, that's a terrorist, or because he or she is Islamic, could possibly be plotting. And I always like to refer to the incident that occurred probably 4 or 5 years ago, where there was a young kid up in Northampton that actually had been radicalized. He had gone out, seen what happened in the Boston Marathon, had bought himself a number of pressure cookers, and it really looked like he was plotting a couple of terrorist activities in Massachusetts. his father, who happened to be a police officer in the Boston area, was very aware of this and eventually turned his son into the FBI. And because of that, they were able to preclude him, the son, from actually implementing a plan that looked like he had been unfolding for a period of time. And his goal was to go to large places where there's large gatherings like universities and set off some of these pressure cooker bombs. That's it. Any questions?
A couple of questions, sure, why not?
Harry, I know that ISIS and Al Qaeda both hide behind the Muslim religion.
Right.
And they would give you the opinion that the Muslim religion is a very violent religion. But I suspect there are a lot of people who are Muslims who are not violent people, and they don't believe that everybody in the world should either be converted to being a Muslim or killed.
Okay.
Is that correct?
And that's right. And that's why you notice in one of my first charts, I said the international Islamic community, not just those who are followers, but also established organizations, they don't endorse at all. That they say that the Islamic religion is not a terrorist religion, that yes, it wants to, in a peaceful way, bring new followers into their belief, but not through violence. And it's unfortunate that you have this movement, well, this fraction within the movement that hides behind the Islamic faith. And that's why, you notice in this chart here, I think out of all these comments here, this is probably the most important. The real answer, when it's all said and done, if we're going to do something about ISIS and something about Al Qaeda, the Arab community have got to band together and recognize that they no longer, can provide financial assistance, provide areas for them to operate out of, into train their terrorist members. I mean, think about Al Qaeda. It was located in Afghanistan. Think about ISIS. It was located in Iraq and in Syria. And so the real answer is it's got to begin here. And they can't just provide lip service. And I think to a large extent that's what's been happening in the past. Yeah. Yes.
Jumping off of that, I see Saudi Arabia has a new prince who's just older, and I know he's got a lot of ideas regarding Iran, and Iran is tied into Syria and Russia, and that's a whole other bailiwick. But
that's right, and that ties into that Sunni-Shiite conflict that I talked about. Saudi Arabia is a Sunni, Syria is Shiite, and so consequently, it's not surprising to see that Iran is very actively supporting President Assad. And it's that clash, that is generating a lot of this conflict that you see in this part of the world, and it's starting to spill over into other parts of the world. Not so much because they want to have that conflict extended internationally, but it's a retaliation to the fact of all these Western countries, especially the United States and Europe, that has been in the Middle East, fighting in Iraq, and now fighting against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria.
So do you think the new prince will, I know he's doing tremendous changes within his own country, but do you think he's also going to address this, and do you think the start of the Arab nations are really going to turn around without U.S. leadership, or do we need to take the lead, or need partnership?
Well, we certainly need to be involved, but we don't need necessarily to take a lead in solving their own problems. Because when we do that, and if something goes wrong, immediately you're seen as the United States intervening in another part of the world where they have no reason to be to begin with. That's the argument that ISIS and Al Qaeda uses. This is all part of this, Islam fundamental movement. The reason why these people have drifted away from the Islamic faith is because of Western influence, with the United States, in the lead as being the one that's most responsible for it.